Well, Shemai, hello to all of you, wherever you might be across the fields and hills of Wales and the world today. This is the Welsh Rev podcast. I'm Simon, I'm Welsh Rev, and you're welcome here today. In this deep dive podcast, we're picking up on something somebody raised a question about last Wednesday at Carmarthen Livestock Market. This man wanted to talk about the war in Gaza and in Lebanon as if they were signs that the end is nigh and we'll soon be looking at the end of the world. Now, I understand where the question was coming from because, our world today feels more uncertain than ever. And the thing is, here in Wales, we feel far away from places like the Middle East and a bit shielded from the chaos going on there at the moment. But the news reaches us, stories of war, terrible pictures and video of the violent destruction that's going on, and fear on people's faces caused by modern warfare. So what about the man's question? He was fascinated with whether this was going to be the end of the world. What about that? It's a lovely autumn day, but the wind is getting up a little bit here. Let's get back inside and look into this question properly. How should we relate to that sort of level of felt threat? So right now, the world is watching the conflict between Israel and Hamas playing out. It's been nearly a year since the fighting began, October the 7th, 2023. And peace seems as far away as ever. And just this month, on the 1st of October 2024, we've seen Israeli forces moving into Lebanon to encourage Iran's partners in the region, Hezbollah, as tensions rise. And I've got friends living in the middle of it. And there are now very real fears the whole region could explode into something even worse. A regional war transforming itself into a war between Tier 1 peer adversaries armed with devastating nuclear weapons that could light the blue touch paper on our world, but that wouldn't allow anyone to stand back from what took place. And the fear is we'd all get caught up in destroying the world we inhabit. Now, last week I met an older man in the march who was worried about all this, and having been contacted by people from not one but two Christian deviations, as we call them, who have long played on such fears about the end times, he was concerned about how current world events might play into biblical prophecies about the end times. You might have heard people talk like that. They start quoting Bible verses out of context, stirring up fear, saying these wars mean the end of the world is upon us. But this morning I want to take a different approach, a biblical approach to fear and the threat of war. We're going to do that this week by looking at the story of King Jehoshaphat from 2 Chronicles 20. And here's the way the passage goes. In 2 Chronicles 20, you've got this introduction of the threat in verses 1 and 2. Chapter begins with this report that the Moabites, Ammonites and some Maonites were planning to attack King Jehoshaphat and Judah. Rumour of a war. There's that immediate announcement of external threat and a dire situation, impending doom. And it creates this massive sense of urgency. It sets the stage for the conflict. And everybody's scared. So what does King Jehoshaphat do? Verses 3 and 4, he seeks God and leads his people to do the same. Jehoshaphat, in his fear then, turns to God, calling for national fasting, seeking God's help with the situation. There's this communal decision to pray. And there's this king's leadership role in uniting the people before God. Jehoshaphat's fear then contrasts with his faith-driven action, highlighting his dependence on God. And that's reflected in what he does next in verses 5 to 12. Jehoshaphat goes to God in prayer. And he prays. Publicly, he makes no secret of the fact. Acknowledging God's sovereignty, God's past deliverance, and the current predicament. And the key factors here are reference to God's power and past faithfulness, the appeal to divine justice, and confession of human helplessness. And structurally in that passage then, the prayer serves as a theological center of this passage. illustrating reliance on God's promises and mercy, and we'll come back to it. So now in verses 13 to 17 of 2 Chronicles 20, you get a prophet turning up. There's a prophecy through Jehaziel. God speaks through Jehaziel, this prophet, encouraging the people, telling them not to fear because the battle belongs to God. And there's the key realization that changes everything. The divine message of reassurance and instruction, not to go out in a conventional way and fight, but to stand firm in Him. And that shifts the narrative from human effort to divine intervention, emphasizing God's control over the entire situation. But absolutely certainly that is not a call to sit back and do nothing. 2 Chronicles 20 verses 18 to 21, there's this preparation, unconventional preparation for battle. Jehoshaphat and the people worship God in response to the prophecy, and Jehoshaphat appoints singers to lead the army. Wait now, singers to lead the army, praising God as they go to the battlefield. The key element is worship before the battle. This unusual military strategy of putting praise and worship of God at the forefront of facing up to the threat. And that reinforces this theme of faith and reliance on God's promises. It contrasts conventional warfare, human strength, with spiritual reliance on God's presence. Now in verses 22 and 24, that just leads straight into tremendous divine intervention and victory. The people begin to sing, the enemies are thrown into confusion, turning against each other, and by the time Judah arrives, the enemy is already completely defeated. The enemies destroy each other without Judah having to fight. That's a climactic resolution of the problem, underscoring the power of God to deliver His people without all this physical combat and the damage of war. Well, as an aftermath in verses 25 to 28, Judah collects a vast amount of plunder. There's tremendous blessing coming out of the situation from the defeated enemies. They return to joy to the Israelites, the Judahites, because they're from Judah, not from Israel, the northern kingdom. And they do it with continued praise and thanksgiving. Divine deliverance. The centrality of worshipping this God who steps in and delivers His faithful people, who are prepared to work in His unconventional ways, but certainly the key issue being trusting God, worshipping Him, giving Him glory in the situation. Well, the outcome in verses 29 to 30 is that the nations around hear of God's intervention, and Judah enjoys peace as a result under Jehoshaphat's reign. Fear of God among the neighbouring nations. Peace and security for Judah, and that conclusion of the narrative with peace, framing the entire story as an example of God's protective power whatever comes, when His people trust in Him. Now that's just the bare bones. Let's try and take a moment to consider what was actually going on in people's hearts and lives in that threatening situation. Back in the day of King Jehoshaphat, and it was 2,800 years ago thereabouts, his kingdom of Judah was in a very real crisis. It was a frightening time. Huge armies ranged against you, massive world power and conflict kicking off between them all, and you in the middle of it. Frightening time. You can imagine it, can't you? Your village, your home, everything you built is under threat from an enemy you cannot stand against. And it does feel like the coming of the end of the world for you. But before we dive deeper really into how Jehoshaphat handled that, we need to remember something important about his father, King Asa. Asa was a king who relied too much on military alliances rather than trusting God. And because of that, his kingdom was cursed with constant war. Now, Jehoshaphat is coming out of that background, out of that experience and situation. He knew the consequences of relying on human strength instead of God. And this is where it gets interesting. Because when faced with an overwhelming army, Jehoshaphat didn't call his generals and start planning military strategy. No, Jehoshaphat turned to God. He called the whole nation to fast and pray, and who knows what his military strategists were thinking at this point. And there's a lesson here for us, guys. When faced with fear, whether it's war or something closer to home like financial struggles or health issues, our first response should not be King Asa's response of looking for the most powerful rulers to make a treaty, nor the cleverest doctors relying on them to keep us going forever, but to seek God as Asa's son Jehoshaphat did, for all the things that are beyond our power. And in his prayer, Jehoshaphat acknowledges something we all need to admit at times. We don't have the strength to handle this on our own. And he says in 2 Chronicles 20, we do not know what to do, but our eyes are on you. That's verse 12. What a powerful thing to say. We don't know what to do, but our eyes are on you. Simple prayer of trust, of placing our worries, our fears in God's hands. Think of it this way. Welsh hill farms have just come through the wettest September on record at a time when grass growth has been hampered for the previous few months by who knows what hampered that. And the number of lambs being offered for sale as store lambs before they're fully fattened tells its own story about grass growth this autumn. The point is for us, there are times when the weather doesn't cooperate with various degrees of catastrophe. Prices drop unexpectedly. That can have the same effect, can't it? We can work hard, plan well, but at the end of the day, we have to trust God for the outcome. Look, when the threat of being crushed and destroyed on the battlefield came to Joshua, he took it to the Lord in prayer. And after Jehoshaphat's prayer, something incredible happens. When God spoke through the prophet named Jahaziel, well, it can't have sounded a terribly welcome message. You see, we all like to run things ourselves, to be independent, to have things in our own hands. But Jahaziel came along. He said, don't be afraid or discouraged because of this vast army. And the question has to be, why not? Well, here's the answer, says Jahaziel. For the battle is not yours, but God's. The battle is not yours, but God's. Now, Jehoshaphat is not being invited to just sit back and wait for God to do his thing. But Jehoshaphat had to get up and go down into the valley and confront the enemy. See, faith works, but it does so trusting in God for the outcome. And guys, that's what we need to hear today. The battle isn't ours, it's God's. So trusting in him to work it out, what we need to do is get up and confront it, relying on God to also step up and meet us as we trust him, work with him, follow his leadership and guidance for the outcome. Whatever we're facing, let's remember that. Do not be afraid or discouraged because of this vast army, this vast threat, whatever it is, for the battle is not yours, but God's. And here's where it gets really exotic. Jehoshaphat doesn't sit back after hearing this message. He gets up, he goes down there, and he leads the people in the singing. That'd be a good pub question, wouldn't it? Pub quiz question. Which king of Judah was a choir master? Jehoshaphat confronted this existential threat to the people of God coming from sources opposed to the God of the Bible, and he did so in God-honouring worship. Instead of sharpening their swords and their spears, he led them on in the singing. Now, can you imagine a whole army walking into battle just singing songs of praise to God? Seems a bit mad, doesn't it? But that's the kind of faith that Jehoshaphat had, and it looks like the sort of faith God wants, because what happened? Down into the valley came the male voice choir, and the enemies turned on each other, and they destroyed themselves before Judah could even engage with the fight. That's the power of putting God and his glory first. When we put our trust in him and give him his due by lifting our voices in our best effort to give him honour, the honour and the praise he deserves, he works in ways we can't imagine. So what are we here in rural Wales to take away from Jehoshaphat to deal with the sort of troubles and anxieties and fears that the state of the world at the moment throws at us? There are a few key points to take away. First of all, seek God first. Whether it's concern about war, a bad harvest, a health scare, our first reaction should be to turn to God in prayer the way Jehoshaphat did. Secondly, Acknowledge God's sovereignty. He is in charge, not us. And that not us is important to go with he is in charge as well. Acknowledge God's sovereignty and deny our own. Jehoshaphat's prayer reminded God of his promises. We should be doing the same, no doubt. And when we feel overwhelmed, we need to remember that God is bigger than any problem we face. And we are actually able to be safe when we are unable to sort our own life out completely and are conscious that we can't and need him. The third thing here, the third point to take away from it is we need to live having faith over our fear. Even when the situation looks dire, like an army coming at you, a big, strong, powerful force to destroy you, trusting that God has a plan deals with the anxiety it kicks up. The prophet told Jehoshaphat from God, the battle is not yours but God's, and that's a truth we can hold on to in every area of life. When the forces of darkness come against us, the battle is not yours but God's. And then this idea of worshipping in the face of the battles we fight. When times are tough, it can be hard to lift our voices in praise. When everything looks like it's coming apart, it's the end of the world for us. But that's when it's most important to do that. That sort of faithful defiance of calamity gives us personal and inner victory over it apart from anything else. It puts our focus back on God, reminds us of his power. A fact we find all too easy to lose track of when times are tough and the threat seems to be coming straight at us, far too real and fast. The final point to take away would be that God fights for his people. The enemies destroyed themselves. Judah didn't have to do anything except trust and obey God and get down there to face the enemy and defy the enemy with songs in God's praise. When we let God take control, we can do far more than ever we could ourselves. So whatever you're facing today, remember this. Seek God, trust his promises, and worship him through it all. And he fights alongside us then, through all our battles. Well, thanks for being with me here today as we've reflected on the lessons from King Jehoshaphat for living in uncertain times. We do live in uncertain times, but the God who delivered Jehoshaphat's people is still with us today, and speculating about what's coming is futile. It changes nothing and it worries us. You just don't know. And there's nothing that we can ourselves, in our own strength, quite probably do about it. But taking on board the Lord's words to Jehoshaphat through the prophet Jehaziel are the way to respond to all this threatening the end is nigh stuff. Do not be afraid or discouraged because of this vast army, for the battle is not yours but God's. Take heart whatever battle you're in, and remember you don't fight alone when you trust the living God. And the Lord is then going to be with you, if you're going to be with him, the way Jehoshaphat was. Now, if this raises any questions for you, please feel free to put it in the discussion or use a contact button to get hold of me. And if this is interesting, please like, subscribe and share. But until next time then, keep your eyes on him. May your homes, your farms, your flocks and your herds be blessed with peace and plenty. That's it from me for this week. Thank you for being with me. Don't forget to subscribe, follow and download that link tree so you get all our regular content on a regular basis.
It calls the loveless in the saints, and creation's